Now let's wrap up chapter 17 with section 17.3. Now in this section we're going to look at the three domains of life, and we're going to look at the six kingdoms that are underneath those three domains. So originally we had two kingdoms, plants and animals, and since then we've been expanding them to include the fungi, Protista. We've had prokaryotes, which were originally Monera, and then they got split into bacteria and Archaea. So ultimately right now, to try and reflect the current diversity as we understand it, largely based upon molecular data. So this is us looking at DNA, at RNA, at proteins. What we see is that the most diversity is amongst prokaryotes. And so the way our kingdoms were set up, even with the six kingdom system, only two of those kingdoms are prokaryotic. So looking at the six kingdoms, it appears as though eukaryotes are more diverse. So rather than invent a whole bunch of new prokaryotic kingdoms to kind of shift the scales, we instead added a taxa that's above kingdom, that's broader than kingdom, and that is the domain. So we have three domains now that encompass all of life, bacteria. So this is a prokaryotic domain that includes the kingdom bacteria. Not too tricky there. Next, we've got the prokaryotic kingdom Archaea. This is going to include the kingdom Archaea or Archaebacteria, you might see it written as. And then lastly, we've got the domain Eukarya. Now this just says eukaryotes, but typically it'd be Eukarya if we're just kind of writing the domain name. And within Eukarya, it has four separate kingdoms. We have Animalia, we have fungi, we have plantae, and we also have the protistans. These will be a lot of the simplest eukaryotes that we have. So this one contains multiple kingdoms, but they're all packaged in one eukaryotic domain to show us that they're all relatively alike, that they're not as diverse as the prokaryotes. So domain bacteria. When you talk about prokaryotes, you're pretty much always talking about bacteria. There are some archaeans that we will discuss, but it's fairly rare. The things that infect us, the things that work for us, like in yogurt, that benefit us, these things are going to be bacteria. They're prokaryotes. They tend to live in conditions that are relatively similar-ish to most other animals and plants, and so oftentimes they're found living together with us. Now, it could be that they're decomposing us. It could be that they're, once again, helping us, like digest stuff. It could be that they're feeding upon us parasitically. Now, some of the characteristics about these guys, besides just being prokaryotic, is they tend to have a cell wall made out of this particular carbohydrate protein mix called peptidoglycan. So I know it's a big, scary word, but it's useful because cell walls are one of the better indicators to determine which domain and which kingdom you belong to. Peptidoglycan is pretty much specific to just domain bacteria. It's also one of the things that our antibiotics target. So things like penicillin, what it's going after is this peptidoglycan, which allows them to go after and kill the bacterial cells while leaving our eukaryotic cells alone. Lastly, these guys are very diverse. You've got cyanobacteria that do photosynthesis. You've got things like Yersinia pestis here, which is the guy that causes the bubonic plague. You've got stuff that breaks down stuff in the soil, that lives in the soil. You've got bacteria that live in a huge variety of places and that do a huge variety of ecological roles. Now, domain Archaea, or once again, kingdom Archaea if you want, these guys tend to be extremophiles. They tend to live in more extreme conditions. And because the early Earth was fairly extreme, we kind of think that these guys might be some of the more ancient cells overall. We know that there was early on a split between bacteria and archaeans, but we're thinking some of these archaeans might have been the very first modernish cells that were around that have persevered through till today. And so if you want to find these guys, you can look in places that are like very salty, like the Dead Sea. You can look at geothermal pools where you can see the streaks here of these archaeans. Although in this case it's not so hot, that you do also see some algae, some regular bacteria. And so we find these in deep sea thermal vents. We can find these in a lot of places that are not hospitable to most life. And so ultimately the end of our planet, like when the sun starts to get hotter, when ultimately the oceans boil away, you'll probably still see some archaeans and maybe even some bacteria living in the rocks, living in these extreme conditions that are left for potentially billions of years before eventually things go molten and we're screwed. So these guys are diverse metabolically. They can live in places like swamps and they can ultimately produce methane as they do metabolism. They can go through and they can live in conditions that are highly extreme in terms of salt, temperature, pH, and they can still manage to survive despite the fact that it's chemically so hostile. So they've evolved many, many different ways of dealing with these extreme conditions and still being able to metabolically function. And so they're kind of neat in that way. These are also the prokaryotes that are most closely related to us. So when we look at eukaryotic cells and we try to figure out chemically who are they closest to, we see that we appear to have been where an Archaean started off, that Archaean had the infoldings of membranes that gave it the organelles, eventually had some guys move inside, endosymbiosis if you remember, to eventually get us to eukaryotic cells. So when you look at a prokaryote, Archaeans are the ones that are essentially our cousin. Kingdom Protista. Now this is in domain Eukarya, so this is eukaryotic. But that's about all you can say. I mean, these guys are just a grab bag. If you're not a plant, you're not a fungus, you're not an animal, you get stuck in Protista, which is why I gave it an asterisk, because scientists pretty much hate Protista. This does not reflect evolutionary heritage. It does not appear that we had one original eukaryotic type cell that eventually became everything. It's likely that what happened is we evolved eukaryotic cells kind of multiple times, or at least early on it had multiple splits that kind of went drastically different, and so we don't like to package them all up together. Now this makes sense because some of these protistans went on to become animals. Some of these protistans went on to become fungi. Some of them went on to become plants. So this is kind of the root of all of the modern things that we have that we think of that are eukaryotic. But we can't just say that they have one particular type of nutrition. Some are photosynthetic. Some of them will eat food. Some of them will excrete enzymes to break it down and then kind of absorb it. They can be multicellular like algae, which in some cases can be hundreds of feet tall. They can also be single-celled. So in general, these guys are eukaryotic and they're not plants, animals, or fungus. Now you might say, why do we still have it if scientists hate it? And the main reason here is we just haven't quite decided how we should break it up. Kingdom fungi is going to be eukaryotes that are unicellular or multicellular. Most of them are multicellular. You still have things like yeast that are unicellular though. And their main way of getting nutrition is heterotrophic. They're going to excrete enzymes onto where they're growing, and those enzymes then break down the organic molecules into smaller molecules, the monomers, which they can then absorb. And so that's the way they're going to get their nutrition. Now, because they're growing on the medium they're eating, so they're growing on their food, they don't move. They have to rely on the fact that they release a bunch of spores, and those have to go through the air and kind of randomly, hopefully luckily, land on a food source where they can then start to grow. This is why if you leave stuff out like bread or other food, oftentimes you'll see fungus start to grow on it relatively quickly because there's spores in the air all the time, and if they land in those good conditions, they start to rapidly grow, take over, digest it, so they can release more spores to keep the cycle going. Now, if you look at their cell walls, you see they contain something special as well. It's not peptidoglycan, in this case it's chitin. So this is the same stuff that you find in the exoskeleton of insects, but ultimately in this case it's found in the cell walls of fungi. Kingdom Plantae will also be in domain Eukarya like all the eukaryotes. These guys are essentially going to be algae that became terrestrial, that moved onto land. And that's why they're so important. They're the base of terrestrial food chains. Whereas when we talk about aquatic ones, it's more cyanobacteria and algae. And so those are ultimately going to be bacteria and protistans. Now these will be multicellular. So if we say it's eukaryotic, multicellular, and autotrophic, so typically photosynthetic, that means we're talking about plants. There are a couple plants that while they're autotrophic, they can also use things like break down stuff like a Venus flytrap, but really what they're doing there is they're breaking them down for nutrients because they live in areas that have water or soils that lack a lot of like the nitrogen, the phosphorus, the basic elements that they need to build stuff. They still use light for energy, but they need the raw materials. And so instead of waiting for the raw materials to just kind of gradually leach into the water, they get proactive. And so they try to go find something that's alive, break it down and decompose it to leach off and steal its nutrients so they can fertilize themselves. Now in their cell walls, because they do have cell walls, just like fungi do, just like many protistans do, although their cell walls are all over the board, their cell walls will have cellulose. So if it's a eukaryote, you have to look and see, well, what's in the cell wall? If it's chitin, chances are it's a fungus, although there are some protistans just to mess with us. And if it has cellulose, I'm typically going to be saying that because it's a plant. There are some algae with cellulose, so once again, protistans screw up everything, but in general, if it's multicellular, always, if it's eukaryotic and has cellulose in the cell wall, we can say that's a plant. Our last kingdom, the one we belong to, is Animalia. So still domain Eukarya. And so we're heterotrophic, a lot like fungus, although we are always multicellular, so we can take the unicellular piece out. Fungus, remember, can be unicellular. But besides just being heterotrophic and eukaryotic, the main thing about our ingestion, our digestion, is that we eat our food. We don't secrete our enzymes to like the environment and then absorb our food. You know, if animals were fungus, we'd essentially like throw up on our food and then lay in it. We shouldn't do that. I hope you don't do that. Instead, we are going to actually physically bring it into our bodies where we have chambers inside of our bodies that will then secrete the enzymes and break it down all internally. We also tend to have some of the highest complexity amongst all life. So we have elaborate tissues, organs, organ systems, which you don't see near as elaborate of organs, tissues, and organ systems in things like a fungus or a plant, even though both of those can be multicellular. And then obviously we've managed to kind of master taking over a lot of the environment. When you look at stuff like algae, it's primarily something that lives aquatic. There's some examples where some algae can live with certain fungus, and it's what you get when you call lichen. So some of those can live on land a bit. But in general, you see animals have taken over the water, they've taken over the land certainly, the soil, and you've even got some of them that have taken to the air. So we're really good at getting around. And so that's allowed for us to kind of fill some niches and to kind of get into places that some of the other stuff has a harder time doing. The last group that we'll discuss, period, and this is an oddball, is viruses. Viruses are technically not alive. They do not carry out the characteristics of life. But they do obviously affect life dramatically enough that we oftentimes still include the classification of them when we're talking about biology. Because it's important we do, because they manage to kill or otherwise impair so many different plants, animals, and other organisms on this planet. Now, they're very simple, so viruses are not near as complex. They don't have cells. They just have some nucleic acid inside, and this can be either DNA or RNA. It depends on the particular virus. Some of your viruses, like HIV, contain a small piece of RNA instead of DNA, but most viruses tend to have DNA inside. And then they have a protein shell that surrounds that, and they tend to be geometric, so they look really cool, like when you see the outsides of these. And this protein shell matters because it's what allows it to attach to specific molecules on certain cells and allows it to inject its DNA. So if you lack those critical molecules, that can mean that the virus cannot infect you. So this is why your dog might get sick, but you don't. This is why some people can get HIV, but there are some Europeans that have a modified molecule on their blood cells, their T helper cells, which HIV normally infects. And because that molecule is not present or modified, HIV is not able to, or at least has a significantly harder time attaching and injecting its DNA, which means these people tend to be relatively immune to HIV. Now, while we do classify them, the system with which we use to classify them will be a modified system. So I want you to realize that if you're talking about taxonomy, viruses oftentimes are going to be grouped and organized by biologists, but we're not normally going to use the traditional kingdom, phylum, class, order, or now that we know about it, domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order system that we've talked about before. Kind of a final note now that we've brought up domain. I know a lot of you guys might have come up with your own little way of memorizing kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Remember now that we did add one guy above that. So instead of just using your typical, K, P, whatever, like King Philip came over for Great Spaghetti, you now need to add that D there. And so now it'd be like, did King Philip come over for Great Spaghetti?